We'll continue with deliverables of a Lean Six Sigma project. What we have to remember is that a Lean Six Sigma project, a DMAIC project, is an investment. So the business is investing time, money, and other resources in order to solve a business problem. And what is very important is at the end of each stage of DMAIC, we make sure that all the correct deliverables have been created and they are up to the required standard. Here is a summary of the key tasks and activities that take place within each stage of DMAIC. So if we start with define, the first thing we have to do is to establish the project. And this typically means two things. We have to select the team members and assign them to the appropriate roles. And second, we have to set up the project control documentation, comprising business case, the team charter or project charter, and some other supporting documents like logs. The second thing is we have to scope the project. This means that we have to determine what is included in the project and what is excluded from the project. And this is typically something that has to be agreed between the project manager and the key stakeholders, especially the sponsor. We have to articulate why this type of work associated with the project is important for the business and valuable to the organization. Next thing, we have to carry out a stakeholder analysis in order to identify who are the key stakeholders of this project, who has a vested interest for the project to be successfully completed. And finally, we have to capture the so-called voice of the customer. And as we're going to learn a little bit later in our course, the voice of the customer is a marketing technique in order to capture the needs, the requirements, and the expectations of customers from the product or service that is created from a process. Phase, we go through the toll gate review, we move to the measure phase. Now, the objective of the measure phase is to make sure that we have a very clear understanding about what is the current state of the process? How does the process that we're trying to improve performs before we make any changes? So the first thing we have to do is we have to prepare a set of research questions, the answers of which will help us in order to solve the business problem. And based on this set of questions, we create the so-called data collection plan. The data collection plan is a control document that describes all the different types of data that has to be collected, who is going to collect the data, at which frequency, etc. All the details associated with data collection. The data collection forms are supporting documents to the data collection plan. And this is where the data collectors are recording the data that is collected in order to answer the research questions. We have to understand and baseline the current state of the process in order to fully understand how the process performs before we make any changes. We have to measure the process performance, which is known as process capability. And later, we're going to learn about the potential process capability, which is indicated as CP, and the actual process capability, which is indicated as CPK. And finally, we have to highlight areas of potential waste on the current state process map. This completes, the measure phase of DMAIC. We go through the gate review and assuming that we move to the next stage, we progress to analyze. Now, the objective of the analyze phase is, first of all, to identify the root causes that create the potential waste that has been identified during the measure phase. And second is to create an illustration of how the improved process is going to look like after all the identified waste has been removed. So we examined the potential areas of process waste one by one. We put them under the Lean lens. And this is an expression that we use in Lean Six Sigma in order to differentiate between waste that is necessary, in other words, it is necessary for the business, for example, and waste that should be eliminated because it adds no value to either the customer or the business. We identify the root causes of process waste by conducting root cause analysis, and later in our course we're going to explain in detail what we mean by this term. We estimate the improvements to be made from eliminating the above forms of waste, and we do this in monetary terms because we want to highlight the impact that each form of process waste in the process costs the business. So we want to quantify the waste. And this gives a better understanding to the senior management regarding how much the current performance of the process is costing the business in terms of operating costs. Finally, we create the 2B, or the future state process map. And we do this by visualizing that all the waste that we identified has been removed from the process, and this is how the improved process is going to look like in the future. This completes the analyze phase. We go through the gate review, we move to the improve phase. Now, this is the first phase of DMAIC where actual process improvements are going to be made. Because so far we collected data, we sourced information from different sources of data, and we analyzed them. But we have not made any changes. So improve is the first stage where we will actually make changes in the current state of the process. First, we have to use the list of validated root causes in order to brainstorm and find potential solutions. Speaking about solutions, these are process changes that are going to eliminate root causes or at least to reduce them. Now, once we have created the list of potential solutions, in order to make it usable, we have to group them, and then within each group, we must prioritize them. Let's talk about the grouping. Typically, we group solutions in 3 buckets. The first one is what we call quick wins. These are process changes that are easy to implement, quick to implement, and they do not require any significant amount of money in order to be made. That's why we call them quick wins. Typically, a quick win should be implemented between a few hours or up to 3 months. The second bucket is what we call medium-term solutions. These are process changes that require more time, more money, and more resources. So typically, a medium-term solution may take anything between 3 months and 6 months in order to be implemented. And finally, we have the long-term solutions, and these are typically associated with process automation activities. and they may last longer than 6 months because these are associated with IT projects. And we know that IT projects take a long time to complete. They are high risk, and also there is a high chance that they may fail. So we finished our grouping, and typically we have sufficient time and resources in order to complete the quick wins. So the next thing we do after grouping is within each group, using business criteria, we prioritize the solutions from the best solution to downwards. So we focus on mitigating and controlling any potential project risks. In other words, when we select, let's say, the top solution in the quick wins bucket, the first thing we have to assess is the risk. If we make this change, is the risk acceptable to the business? Assuming that the risk is acceptable, next thing we have to do is to pilot the solution, in other words, to test and make sure that by making the change, the process actually improves. And once we have achieved this, the final step is to implement the change in the process. We pilot and implement using the PDCA cycle: plan, do, check, and act. And this is a continuous improvement model that we're going to explain a little bit later in our course. Finally, after we have made all the changes in the process, we update the process-related documentation. This includes the 2B process map that we have created during the analyze phase. And we use this updated documentation in order to train the people that are going to monitor the improved process. The final step during the improve phase of DMAIC is to prepare the so-called control plan. So this plan has all the information that we need in order to monitor the improved process in the final stage of DMAIC, the control phase. So we prepare it during improve, and we implement the plan during the control phase. We completed the improve, we go through the gate review, we obtain permission in order to move to the final stage of DMAIC, and this is the control stage. The purpose of this DMAIC stage is to make sure that the improved process is stable, as we call it, in statistical control, which means that it produces predictable process outputs in the form of products or services. Second, we want to verify and validate that the changes we made in the process, they had the desirable effect. And finally, we want to make sure that the process is ready in order to be handed over from the project to the day-to-day operations. So we implement the control plan and we monitor the improved process for a short period of time, typically a few weeks, let's say 4 weeks. We make sure that the process changes that have been made have been embedded in day-to-day operations, and we achieve this by standardizing the improved process. And finally, after we hand over the improved process to the day-to-day operations, which is typically represented from the so-called process owner, then we have to go through a series of administrative tasks associated with the project. And once these are completed, then we ask permission from the project sponsor in order to formally close the project and inform the key stakeholders. Once the project has been closed, the project team is disbanded and the benefits realization period begins. On this figure, we have a number of pieces of information associated with the Six Sigma DMAIC project. First of all, we see the 5 stages: define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. Above its stage header, we have what is the objective of each particular DMAIC phase or stage. And below its header, we have the tasks and activities as well as the deliverables associated with each of the 5 phases. This is a more enhanced view about deliverables of a Lean Six Sigma project. As you can see at the top, we have the 5 stages of DMAIC, and under each of the stages, we see what are the outputs and outcomes of each particular stage. This is for define, measure, analyze, improve, and control.